Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Leah Hines, Executive Director for the Charleston Conference, and I'm here with Lindsay Cronk and Sean Valancourt to present Crunch Time, Frameworks to Assess and Improve End-of-Year Spending. Lindsay is the Head of Collections and Strategies at University of Rochester, and Sean is the Collections Specialist and Educations Librarian at the University of Houston. We're super happy that they're here with us today. The little backstory on this was a session that was actually scheduled to take place at the conference this year, and due to a variety of illness-related issues, poor Lindsay, it had to be canceled at the very last minute, and we were super bummed that that happened, and we're happy to be able to present this content and information to y'all through a webinar. So thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Sean, for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. And we do want to give special thanks to the Charleston Conference for making this possible. The magic of the internet means that we get to have our presentation after all. And we're just so grateful for the opportunity to be here with all of you today, particularly so close to the holiday. Thank you for your enthusiasm for this content. And I know that Sean and I are both really excited to talk to you today. So we called our presentation Crunch Time because it's just this piece of the work that we all have to face and confront all the time. Thinking about how do we make mindful, informed, sustainable decisions when it's the end of the year, and how do we reflect on it, assess it, and make sure that we're making the right decisions. Let's try taking off my picture and see if it improves. Please know that I'm still here and I'm still a person. So basically, again, we were talking, and the work came out. Yeah, I'm on Chrome too. Basically, we were talking about this, and at the time we were working together at the University of Houston, and it was a topic that we were all reflecting on and working through with a large group of selectors. And just as we started to approach developing these frameworks, we thought that they'd be valuable to share with other folks at other universities and colleges. So I also want to say, Sean, can you advance the slides? I don't know if I can. Welcome. So we're so glad that you're here today. It's to get started, we're talking again about crunch time and end-of-year frameworks. And this is all about acknowledging the role that time and timing play in collection development, that we're all sort of slaves to the clock, the budget calendar, and that we have to adhere to it. Time is sort of thematically what we're going to be talking to you about today. I'm going to turn it over to Sean to talk about our agenda.
Yeah, so today what we're going to be doing is moving holistically through a discussion of the challenges of end-of-year decision-making. So we're going to be looking at how we started asking these questions, through to how we actually tried to assess it, and some of the fallout from that in future possible solutions.
I thought it would be fun to give you guys a poll question, actually. So I'm going to share this with you, and please feel free to participate. The question is, have you been involved in a large one-time purchase at the end of the year? And I'm seeing, hang on, I'm going to share this with you so you can see it. So it's climbing and climbing. I'm going to give it just a couple more seconds here. Thank you, everyone, for participating. So it looks like we have, 91% at least of our participants, and it makes sense given the subject matter today, have participated in a large one-time purchase. And then a quick other question. And that is, how frequently does this happen at your workplace? Yeah. So here, let me share this with you guys. So as you can see, we're all in this same sort of work, and we all face these challenges all the time. So when we're beginning to think more about how we can build frameworks for this and how we can do a better job with end-of-year spending, it's wonderful to know that we're not alone, that we all share this perspective. Sorry, Sean, can you advance it again? So speaking of us, let's take a quick moment for those introductions of ourselves. So Leah was very kind. I am, again, Lindsay Kronk, Head of Collection Strategies at the University of Rochester. Before that, I was Coordinator of Online Resources and Collections at the University of Houston, which is where I met Sean. And I love to think through how we can be innovative in terms of confronting challenges like these, and how we can do a better job, and how we can sort of flip legacy processes.
And just to throw in who I am again, I'm Sean Valancourt, now currently collection specialist and education librarian at the University of Houston. And we did start looking at this when Lindsay was here, before she left us. And then when she moved on to her new position, we were able to actually expand the scope of our research to compare both institutions and get a bit of a bigger picture of this problem.
So I think this would be a great time for you guys to tell us about you as well. So here, I'm going to share this with you guys. What best describes your role? Oh, a wonderful variety. So part of what I like about asking this question is that it reveals how many different departments and how many different levels of organizational hierarchy too are typically involved in year-end decision-making. Just going to close that poll. And Sean, do you want to talk a little bit about what our goals are today?
Yeah, so we engaged with this topic because at the University of Houston, selectors would be approached regularly at the end of the year to recommend resources to spend that last little bit of money that we had in the budget that we hadn't had eaten up by inflation or anything else. And so it was usually last minute, a source of stress and concern. And we were never really sure that the large one-time purchases we were getting justified their purchase. So because we believe this is a shared challenge in a variety of library settings, we wanted to share our experiences and approaches, and hopefully it would help other people at least get thinking about this topic and what they might be able to do locally in their own situation.
Oh, we have a question. So my connection, it's this looks like a troubleshooting thing. Leah, can you help? My connection has to be reconnected. I'm on Chrome. Someone's working on that. Don't worry. So I wanted to quickly, draw to your attention sort of these aspects of our situations in which you may find resemblances of your own. But I'm going to lead with my favorite joke of this presentation, which is like sands through the hourglass. So are the dollars spent on electronic resources. While we briefly sort of described what prompted our investigation, I think sharing more context can only improve our sort of what we're sharing with you today. Oh, good. I know I can advance slides. Oh, I'm so excited. Okay, so Sean, go ahead.
So the situation at the University of Houston, again, as I mentioned, selectors would be approached to recommend resources to be purchased on a one-time basis, sometimes with ongoing access fee costs. As we know, that tends to come up a fair bit with these kinds of resources. And there was always this rush to generate ideas, and then we would purchase the items, and we would process them and get them mounted and linked up, and then never think about them again. Although I really shouldn't say never. We would, of course, promote these things to our patrons and encouraged users to get the most out of the great content we had purchased for them. But just like a lot of the books that we purchase and put on the shelf, on a just-in-case basis, some of these things would sit on their own shelf, so to speak, and get little or no attention. So what we wanted to figure out is if there were ways that we could make smarter decisions about the resources we selected, so that we would be investing funds in places that would get a better long-term return on investment. So were there resources where ROI was not what we had hoped? And in general, we were hoping for lots of ROI, but sometimes it wouldn't be getting much return on our investment, and the situation wouldn't be improving. So maybe we could look at cutting loose these resources and avoiding to continue to pay any access fees, or even for those that didn't necessarily have access fees, those intangible costs to maintain access to them. Was there a way that maybe we could weed this electronic collection so that it would better serve our patrons?
And then I accepted my position at the University of Rochester, and it was not surprising to me that I found a different budget situation, a different structure for collection decision making, but the same assessment needs in terms of our end of year purchasing. University of Rochester, we are very lucky, and it is something that I want to preface. Many of my perspectives are those of an ARL collection development person. So I have a lot of privilege in this. My institution has a lot of privilege in this. We have a very structured desiderato process. We still struggled after exhausting particularly the most obvious backfile options. When we had purchased the things that made sense, what were we then supposed to do here at the end of the year? I jokingly refer to the process of end of year spending periodically. I use the analogy of the change in the couch, in the cushions, right? And so you shake out that couch and you wind up too with weird amounts of money and very short time frames. And that's true everywhere. But in ARLs, it can become burdensome. And I mean, any institution, it can become burdensome. And you don't want to be creating a stressful situation for your selectors, for your acquisition staff, for all of the many parties involved in these decisions. To my mind, from a department head perspective, I started to ask a few questions. One, when does one time actually become a structural deficiency in the budget? And when does one time the spend that we put in it actually reflect an inflexibility rather than an efficiency or a more agile budget structure that maybe is what we should be exploring? Another question I had was, how do we then evolve our materials budgets to meet the changes we're addressing everywhere in scholarly communications? And then also, how can we collaborate effectively during what I call crunch time? Before we move on to this next section, I have another poll question for you guys. Let me put it in front of you. Polls. So I'm headed to, oops, hang on. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. You get to listen to the sounds of me narrating scrolling, but here. If you have to choose one term, and this is, I hope, a useful range of them, to describe your experience of one-time purchasing, what would it be? Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of votes for hectic, some for anxiety-inducing. Definitely it is exciting, and I think we sometimes lose track of that. People talk a lot about movies you love to hate, right? But I think one time actually I would say is an experience that I hate to love. I get excited that we have the money. I want us to do better, right? So moving on. This aspect of the collaborative too is, I think, part of what adds to that stress we experience around crunch time, right? We need to communicate with so many different stakeholders, and how do we do this in a way that is mindful? At the University of Houston, we had a formal body that worked to collaborate that was representatives of different basically constituencies, again, within the process. We called it the Collection Management Committee. At the University of Rochester, it is a more informal process. And in a recent development, I've sort of developed these disciplinary groups where people can collaborate. But there are challenges, and they're specific to the end of the year for collaboration in particular. Particularly if you're developing and vetting a list in a very short period of time, the lack of opportunity to prepare a communications plan for, particularly if you're trying to have, communications with faculty, with your students. and the inability even of your internal stakeholders, right, to meet. There are schedules, there are alternating demands, and acknowledging that good outreach takes time. We shouldn't be applying budget pressure to either our internal stakeholders or to our external stakeholders is an aspect that I recognize in this process.
So we're often fighting the clock in many ways, but what we wanted to do in our assessment was ask if we started to use, if we could start to use this interval of the clock as a means of assessment. So each budget year doesn't exist in isolation. They roll one into the other. And the budget cycle is endlessly a construct. So could that construct empower our assessment? And I would argue yes. So we began to think through how we could get to know what return on investment on our past collection decisions had been in order to inform our future collections decisions. No one makes good decisions under pressure, but if we can create some framework to work within, then that pressure could push you through the framework to a more desired outcome rather than just kind of exploding everywhere.
we have another poll question for you guys here, and that is, what are your current frameworks that you have in place for preparing for end-of-year purchasing? Let me share the results with you guys. So yeah, this in general, this is what I see too. The desiderata, some identified areas for growth, right? Like we have a loose understanding of where there's need, and maybe we have this, if we're lucky, right, a workflow in place.
So in terms of collecting the data we needed, we were pulling from a number of different sources. We use Sierra locally here, and so from there we were able to pull cost data from our order records, both the annual costs for any existing access fees that we needed to pay, and those were actually more readily identified since we were still writing checks for them, and then also the original cost of purchase, whether in a single or multiple payment plan. And some of those involved more hunting, especially where there wasn't a continuing access fee, and the different payments could be across different records just because of changing practices over time. So there was a bit of hunting there. We, of course, pulled usage stats from the different vendors that were providing the content. And we aimed for counter if possible, but of course some of these resources have non-counter statistics as the only option.
And I think that's important to acknowledge here too, just to interject, Sean, is we've all been online for long enough too, and making online purchases for long enough that some of these resources predate standards for usage data, and it's actually a unique aspect of the challenge. And it makes you aware, I think, of the fact that I think we have this sense in other aspects of our collection of what it means to be longtime stewards of something, but we're all still grappling with it in terms of online resources, and particularly online one time, which is a tongue twister.
So I had mentioned that we were readily able to identify some of the one-time purchases where there were additional access fees and we were still cutting a check. We were also able to use the very in-depth meeting minutes from the Collection Management Committee to identify some other one-time purchases where really the only evidence that it was a single-time purchase was because it was mentioned in the meeting minutes for that end-of-year spending meeting. And then we also, on our website, we would classify our resources under different kinds of content types. And we used that information so that we could compare different resources categorically in their performance to see what categories were performing well versus others. So that would be things like data sets, literary works, that kind of thing built into our local classification.
That subject level analysis I found to be one of the most interesting parts.
It was definitely useful. So in our analysis of all of this data we had pulled, once we had identified the one-time resources and gathered up this data and hunted down order records that weren't linked up, we started figuring out what annual costs were for any given database. And this was just your access fees. We didn't calculate out any kind of intangible costs, even though we know they're there for any resource that we set up and link out to our patrons. Then we also looked at the cumulative cost over time. So we were taking the original cost of purchase, whether in pieces or a single one-time check, and also adding up how much we had paid in access fees over the years. And we used that total cumulative cost to calculate a return on investment by taking the total use over time from what data we had and calculating a total cumulative cost per cumulative usage. So we also calculated out year by year how that return on investment was changing. So as we added another year of access costs and usage, we were adding that into our calculations and comparing it to previous year's performance.
And looking at the use trend, I also think was one of the most important parts of this for me. If you're looking over the course of any sort of electronic resource, this is a tool that I think makes it easier to at a glance see, is use growing, is use declining, is use staying fairly neutral. It can be an extremely illuminating way to begin to think through not just here what we continue to support, right? But in terms of the ongoing renewals we make, is what are we seeing in terms of these trends?
Yeah, and being able to answer the question of, are we still sinking money into a resource that is giving us less and less return on investment over time? It's an important consideration to make, and can identify things that maybe it's time to cut loose, even if we haven't gotten all of our money out of it.
Exactly.
Okay, so what we found is that for in most categories, the return on investment would underperform other resources, but categorically, the two well-performing areas were our literary resources and our ebooks. But in other areas, the ROI would deplete over time, with the exception of general journal or article collections that were isolated. We did have to exclude any back files that we had purchased because we couldn't separate the usage out of the back file collection versus an ongoing cumulative subscription to a resource. But where we did have a singular collection of periodicals, an archive of journal articles, those did tend to perform well over time.
So at the University of Rochester, we found a sort of similar set of results. And that's that usage declines over time. And that means simply, and I think that this is actually pretty common, or it makes sense to me, is more of how I would put it. So when you purchase something, there's interest, there's initial interest, and that interest is higher at the front end than it is in the back end. It's about currency, right? And so when we decide to maintain perpetual access to something, I think that this is an aspect that we need to consider. On my end, it wasn't so much that ROI declined as the ROI stagnated. As a result of that initial boom into lower usage, and then in many cases, ultimately almost no usage, the ROI peaks early, and what you pay per use in those first couple of years is often your cumulative cost per use, in my experience. Another thing I found was that having designated one-time funds that are university allocated along with endowments created an oversupply for one-time purchases. Essentially what I'm saying is when we went to shake that couch at the end of the budget year, there was more there, which made these decisions even more challenging because there were so many permutations and options. And budget communications around this, I now find to be an opportunity for morale and team building, culture change, the opportunity to have more transparent conversations and to be clear about where did all of these sort of pieces of budget that fell together to piece together this one-time purchase come from. It offers a real educational opportunity about endowments, about the structure of the budget itself. And it wasn't something that I had historically seen because, again, it's crunch time. You're doing so much in such a short period of time that it can be difficult. It can be overwhelming, right? But this is one of the key pieces in it. It's not necessarily about this beautiful formula that was Sean's idea of it, but it's more about what are the broader implications of that one-time purchase and how do we turn this into something that brings us together and elevates us as a team, as opposed to being something that makes us all anxious and frazzled. So, next steps. If we're moving from tracking time to setting a tempo, how can we regulate again? How can we take advantage of these opportunities we're seeing? How can we employ this assessment framework to make better decisions and also to put us in a better position as organizations? So I think we have to begin by acknowledging that we are missing pieces. We are in search of those missing data points. One of the ones that we considered early in our investigation that didn't wind up being something that we could do in a way that was regular or standard was the number of records in one of these archives. And because the archives themselves hold such diverse content, data sets, journal articles, sometimes books, sometimes weird ephemera, digitized, content. It's hard to get that standard, but I see it and I know it could be valuable in terms of this assessment. And I know Sean has plenty to offer in this topic.
Yeah, well, I mean, one data point that I've been considering just beyond looking at how much stuff we have to search through and how that affects how much searching and finding people are doing in there, it is even just simple campus population over time. And a lot of that reflection comes out of the fact that the University of Houston has been going through dramatic growth since I've been here, and I've been here eight years now, something like that. And how does that vast increase in population affect our usage? Or does it affect the usage? And as program areas are being developed and different departments are seeing dramatic growth, are they experiencing, or are resources in those areas experiencing a lot of change in usage over time? So, we want to ask things like, can we tie our usage of different resources to our student and research populations to account for these changes?
And I do think that demographic data would be invaluable. If you can get to the point where you can link the resource to a subject, to a group, you could get to a much deeper and fuller understanding of not just what is the impact of your resource, right, but how to connect people to resources they might be interested in. Because I do think part of where one time suffers and the decisions we make at the end of the year become so critically important and also so challenging to manage is we have such broad and deep online collections at this point. It's one more resource in a sea of resources. And so when we're devoting time, right, to promoting things, we often forget about one time.
And I should also mention that some one-time purchases can also apply in relevance to more to certain subject areas more than others. Like one thing we actually found is that we just didn't have a lot of science resources in our one-time purchases. In our analysis, and a lot of that was because really the information that was of most relevance to science people that could purchase on a one-time basis happened to be back files, which again we had to exclude, like I mentioned before. So it was just another point that we had to consider.
Definitely, and I think Sean, you hit it on the head too. Like the kinds of one time that are available to us, is inherently a bias. And when you're looking at what the field is crowded with, and I'm thinking of particularly the archives that are available through ProQuest, the mini newspaper archives, or through Gale, their archives, the Adam Matthew content. It's always, well, it's mostly skewed right towards the social sciences and the humanities.
So in general, we know that a big part of the headaches and the pain points of the end of year spending are less about the workflows and more about open and clear communication. So some ways that we can improve involve sharing and communicating our findings. So for example, here at U of H, we were able, as we were dealing with a budget shortfall this year, we were able to actually use the data that we had here to look at some of the one-time purchases that had larger access fees, annual access fees that weren't performing so well, to offer up as sacrificial lambs to help pad the impact of the budget issues that we were facing. We can also look into greater preparation, so that now that we know where our best return on investment is, we can make future purchase decisions that favor those areas and get better long-term returns rather than a free-for-all dumping money into any place that'll take us. And we can look at creating more dynamic budgets, communicating budget uncertainty in a way that is productive, and in particular, what is a good one-time purchase in the just-in-time collection is a big area of focus here at U of H now, because we're shifting our collections philosophy away from just-in-case towards just-in-time purchasing, starting with things like implementing print DDA, and turning off our approval plans. So how can we apply this in a one-time kind of basis as well?
And I think most of us, right, have moved away from the just-in-case model. And I do think that that's part of the challenge at the end of the year is no matter what you're doing, it sort of feels like you're, I remember one of my favorite analogies that a selector ever used to explain to me the annoyance of the just in case model was, I feel like I'm buying Christmas presents for people I don't know very well. And I think that that's the thing is, particularly with one time when it's a large scale purchase, there's the additional stress of how am I being a good steward with this? And that's actually something that I think we need to think about more holistically. And as a group, I think libraries, if we're thinking about one-time purchasing, we should be thinking more about open access and the future sustainability of collections for all, because that is a clear one-time investment that has benefits not just for the student populations and faculty researchers that we serve, but for students and faculties everywhere. We can also be better at collaborating with our colleagues in rare books and special collections, where they typically have auction catalogs and prepared desiderata that might be a better fit for our end of year purchases. Figuring out how those purchases too can be made in collaboration with that general collection, how our collections can complement one another, I think is so critical. And then we can also support digitization and preservation initiatives. I'm thinking about what resources do we have already, maybe not in online, that it would make sense to take that money and make available online. And then finally, and Sean really hit on this too, making friends with uncertainty and owning that opportunity for clearer communication and team building. Because the thing is, when we're talking about collections, we're talking oftentimes about really large groups of people doing very different work within our library. This is the place where we can all come together and all work together and all see the value of what we're doing. So I actually want to open it up for one last poll, maybe it's my last poll question. Let me double check, you guys. Yeah, this is one of the last questions that I wanted to ask you guys, which is, how much does your budget structure influence your end of year spending? And yes, me too. And that's the piece that I think, particularly those of us who are in positions of power within the hierarchies of our organizations, need to be making that case for how do we make the budget more agile. It's not just our collections, right, that are just in case or just in time. If we're having a category that is just one-time spending, I would argue we're still advocating a just-in-case culture. So we're a little ahead of schedule, but at this point, we want to open it up to you guys for questions. And just again, say thank you so much for coming out. So if you have questions for us, we are comments, thoughts. I'm always in favor of webinars like this and presentations, particularly at the Charleston Conference, as a sort of shared communal experience. So if you just want to share your experiences, we're also open to hearing those. You can feel free to use that chat window too if you don't feel like talking out loud. Oh, and there's the Ask a Presenter question, which is a beautiful aspect of this platform and interface. So Sean, one thing I've been wondering is, how is that transition going at the University of Houston? We're making the same transition from just in case to just in time, or we're trying to adapt, right, culture, budget, and the collection to that.
It's going. It's still very very nascent. So we've turned off our approvals, and we are hoping, fingers crossed, that in the new semester we'll start getting print DDA records. We're just trying to figure out how to get it to play nicely with our system. But we're pretty sure we've got the workflows figured out. So there's at least that, and I think everyone's pretty well getting into the mindset of asking the question. It's like, okay, who is asking for this? Is anyone asking for this? Do we really need to engage with a vendor on this if you know it's the vendor that approaches us versus a patron showing an interest in integrating some resource into their teaching or research. So we're getting there, but we're still kind of getting used to this new approach.
Brave new world.
Yeah.
And I would say, again, it's so much more than, it's that shift right from to discovery as delivery. And we actually have a question that came up, which is there any evidence to show that users abuse the PDA-DDA model? There's a concern at my library not to advertise that this is even a thing. Any thoughts? And I find this question fascinating. I have not seen abuse of this. And in general, I'm all in favor of empowering our users to drive the collection. What do you think, Sean?
That was a concern that has been raised here. We know that we have certain faculty members who are more invested in what's in the collection, and there is concern that they might just go in and just do all the just-in-case purchasing themselves anyways. But, I mean, from what we've heard of other institutions that have gone with print EDA, there hasn't been any real dramatic bankrupting kind of spending in this area, and actually the amount of materials that we have coming in or that they have had coming in has gone down. So we're kind of expecting something similar here, but who knows? We may be the case where someone walks in and is like, I'm going to order all the books. And
well, I have a funny story about this, which was that a history faculty member in History Lives in our building actually brought me in a stack of records, thinking that they were just ebooks. And he said, we don't have any of these in print. And it was a wonderful opportunity to talk to him about the benefits of having things in print and online too. So when you're making that case to someone who is very format committed to talk about the value of diverse formats, I think it's an opportunity. It's never an easy conversation, right? But you can talk about where the library is going and how the library is changing. And I think that you can really change minds and influence people that way, which, build an ally where before you had someone who was concerned about your practices. We have some other questions, John. Did you explore the relevance of a resource like Knowledge Unlatched? At the University of Rochester, we absolutely support Knowledge Unlatched, and I'm a firm believer in the work that they're doing. So it's absolutely a place where we put some of our one-time funds. Sean, open access is a little challenging for state institutions. Did you want to talk about that at U of H at all?
Yeah, and I remember us talking about Knowledge Unlatched at one point, but I can't remember what the end decision was when we talked about it. But I do know it was brought up with selectors, and we gave some feedback, and administration made some sort of decision about it. I believe it was positive, but I can't remember if it was positive, like, we're going to do this right now, or this is something we're going to do at some point. But I remember that there was general support for the idea behind Knowledge Unlatched.
Yeah, we have. I'm just going to keep going through these. I like the idea of using one-time funds to purchase rare materials for digitization. Have you implemented this collaboration with your special collections folks at your institutions? So at University of Rochester, we're absolutely pursuing this right now. And part of where we see an extension of it too is, I don't know how aware you may be of it's a Library of Congress, or is it a UC Santa Barbara? Anyway, Thomas Padilla is the primary investigator, and it's an ILMS-funded project called Collections as Data, which is just looking at how we can take what's on our shelves and turn it into textual data to support research. The idea being that what is a collection if not a huge font of textual data? So we're very interested not just in that digitization and the metadata enrichment, obviously, but also in using those then to create data sets. So the collection becomes another collection, right? It is transformed into a new format. And I think that that's so exciting.
As for U of H, I don't know that we've started putting that specific funding that was left over at the end of years towards digitization. I know we've picked up a few grants along the way with a couple of our Spec All people, but I don't think we've formally started designating that money for digitization yet at this point. Although I'm certain they would be happy to take the money and apply it to digitization if we did.
It's about maintaining the balance, right? And I do think that that's a critical part of the way we approach and diversify our budgets, which I think leads well into Ethan Cutler made the comment. I'm curious to learn more about dynamic budgets. Ethan, to your point, to my mind, this is sort of the future of what we need to do. And it's a little bit challenging because of the way we've always made our case to administration. And by administration, I'm referring to the folks at the top of that budget food chain who are looking at our materials budgets and approving it or not. But basically, the budget itself is a construct. And Sean and I talked about this at various times, the budget year itself, but also the little pots we put this into. And actually, I would say, Andrea, this refers to your question about the allocated budget too. Yes, we put things into smaller funds and smaller budgets, but ultimately it's the big bucket at the end. And I think that in our efforts to front end efficiency by allocating, we're actually creating a fundamental inefficiency, a sort of residual just in case culture, where we're saying you should be allocated this much based on these factors at the beginning of the year, instead of allowing need to drive where the collection goes. It's a little bit challenging, right, to create that flexibility, but that's what I'm talking about when I talk about dynamic budgets. And Andrea, to your point, yes, we have an established allocations process, and it has been a challenge to figure out how to create that agility within it. Sean, at U of H, I don't think the allocations work the same way, to my memory.
No, the allocations at U of H are essentially not there anymore. We when I first arrived here, we had a given budget for different subject areas, and then that got collapsed into a given budget for discipline areas. So there was a science, a social science, and a humanities fund for doing our purchasing. And now we're pretty much down to, there is a big bucket and spend as you need. And now that's going to be the bucket that patron requests are drawn out of. So I think really the only separations we have in terms of subjects are, we still identify journals by different subject areas, different subject funds, but I mean, there isn't really a set allocation for serial spending. It's kind of what you have is what you have to work with. And if you can cut out of it, that's great. Or when you have to cut, that's what you do. But there isn't really a formal allocation per subject area anymore.
And I think that that's exactly, so I think that there's the benefit of people knowing, this is how much I should be spending for my faculty. But I still think that when we're embarking upon that, we're putting still too much of a strain upon selectors to make judgments, and to basically we're turning them into buyers instead of turning them into partners and collaborators with our faculty. And when we talk about collections with faculty in particular, to my mind, it should always be a sort of outreach piece. This is what we have that we think supports your work. And you can do that through a few sort of bibliometric techniques, or by looking at citations, by looking at researcher networks, right? And all of that then can be turned into narrative that supports the value of your collection. So I'm always more interested in, with the limited amount of time that we can expect our subject selectors at this point to be spending in collections, more of that work, more of that critical assessment and outreach work than, title by title selecting something to spend out a fund that they have been allocated. We have another question. I'm just going to really quickly jump to Samantha's question. Samantha, Knowledge Unlatched is an open access initiative, which basically it opens up books. And they're books by, I think, subject area. I may be butchering this, but it's a very cool program where you put in a certain amount of money too, and then you get kind of a vote on what you think should be made available. So you can represent your institution's need, right? So it still allows you that specificity, that institution-specific specificity. I just use specific and specificity right next to each other, but I think you get what I mean. It's a more sort of involved open access model. I think it's just beautiful. And then Susan, do flexible payment plans from publishers help when deciding to purchase digital back files as a one-time purchase? In my case, I would say yes, but we don't love to commit to multi-year agreements because it creates an inflexibility for the next year. So we're dependent on having that money the next year. So it creates a inflexibility in the long term. You're looking ahead 5 years down the line. You're doing your projections, and you've got to account for the fact that there's another $5,000 coming out next year. And I don't love that. And in general, with one time, if I have to make a move, I'd like for us to spend, that portion of the couch change that's from, we didn't do the sprinklers this year. That section of the couch change that's from what was left in my allocated funds, and that section of the couch change that's from, I don't know, something that got recouped somewhere else, and spend it there because I don't know if it's coming back. So I think those are the questions we had. Oh, what a cool, engaged, and awesome audience you guys are here on December the 20th, 2017. It is just such a pleasure having spent some time with you guys. And Sean, I just want to acknowledge you as an awesome collaborator here. Leah Hines, I want to say a special thank you from both of us, again, for making this happen after our initial presentation was thwarted. We do hope you guys will keep in touch with us. We're online, and I can't stop tweeting, so you'll always hear exactly what all of my opinions are. If you have, I know. If you have questions or thoughts, or about this that occur to you later, you can shoot them to us on Twitter. You can shoot them to us via email. If you're interested in future collaborations, if you want to hear, if you're interested in implementing an ROI assessment at your workplace, we want to be there to support you.
And this is Leah again, just jumping back in to say thank you to Lindsay and Sean for being here. Thank you for an awesome presentation. And thanks to all of you for tuning in and listening today. This session, I did put it on the chat earlier, but it is being recorded, and we're going to put it on the conference website along with the slides from today. So if you missed a piece for any reason or whatever, you want to go back and look at a slide, it'll be there probably by end of day tomorrow. From all of us at the Charleston Conference, I hope you have a wonderful holiday break and a happy new year. And thanks again, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks.